Assalamu alaikum dear students, and welcome to the 52nd session of the KIPS Distance Learning Program. If you're following the news these days, you might have experienced that some things are changing in the relationship between the Muslim world and the West, and that change is quite significant. And that change basically started with a particular speech by a particular leader of a Western democracy. But before we get into that, let's get the fundamentals straight. What is Islamophobia? Well, Islamophobia is basically a fear of Muslims or Islam or Islamic symbols or anything that is related to Muslims in general by non-Muslim people, especially the Western people. So if you look at a brief history of Islamophobia, it actually has a long history, contrary to what most people think. If you think about the historical relationship between the Christian world and the Muslim world, it goes back at least as far as 1200 years to the Crusades, and perhaps that's when the roots of Islamophobia were laid down in the first place. Then we had significant events in the following centuries as well, which further cemented the sort of rival relationship between Islam and non-Muslim cultures, especially the Christian world, where wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Western different empires in Germany, in France, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and moreover, they further cemented the controversy of Islamophobia. And if you look at the recent waves of Islamophobia, they also have history in the 20th century. Specifically, I believe modern Islamophobia has its roots in the year 1979, when the Iranian Revolution came and the Iranian students basically kidnapped the entire staff of the American embassy, and we had the Iranian hostage crisis, which is when a true anti-Islam and Islamophobic attitude was developed by the media and the state of America within the population of America, which later on spread into other parts of the Western world, with the rise of extremism, fundamentalism, terrorism in the Muslim world, outside the Muslim world, as a reaction to the Mujahideen-led Afghan Jihad and the Iran-Iraq war and then the Gulf War. So these three important wars are the fountainhead of the emergence of terrorism, Islamism, and political Islamic radicalism within the Muslim world, which further assured the Western populations and political leaders that perhaps Islam is a danger to them, which was quite accurately summarized in Samuel P. Huntington's famous article, which was then later on converted into a book, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order, in which he discussed how the Muslim civilization poses a significant threat to the Western civilization, along with a sort of confluence that they will create with the Confucius civilization, by which he means the Chinese people. And then again, the 9/11 event further augmented the Islamophobic attitudes within the broader Western world, because Muslims and Islam were blamed for 9/11 and all the following terrorist activities that happened all around the world, and the rise of Al-Qaeda, and finally the rise of ISIS in 2014 in Syria and Iraq created an international wave of fear of Muslims, of radical Islam, which has to date been further augmented and presented in the Western media, to the extent that now Western media isn't even hesitant to call all Muslims terrorists, and whenever there is any debate of terrorism or any kind of radicalism that happens around the world and there are attacks, the first instinct of Western media and Western leaders is to blame it on Muslims, because according to them, terrorism, fundamentalism, and extremism is an exclusive domain of the Muslim world and a principle of the Islam. And to bolster their claims, they basically quote the Jihad verse from the Quran, that fight them until they are no more, but they don't understand the context of it quite naturally. And this is where we should blame ourselves, our political leaders, our intelligentsia, and our religious leaders as well, because they have been unable to counter this Islamophobic narrative in the world, and instead, in many cases, their activities have promoted this narrative among Western audiences. So, the most recent Islamophobia is concerning blasphemic caricatures that were made by a particular media outlet in France by the name of Charlie Hebdo. But before we discuss that, we must also understand that Islamophobia has a long history in France. France is the largest Muslim diaspora in Europe, and that Muslim population is rapidly increasing, while the French population is not increasing substantially, and they are actually decreasing in number. So the French feel threatened by the increasing presence of Muslim populations, and they fear that they will erase the French character in the French population, and France will one day become a Muslim state or an Islamic state within the heart of Europe. And that was quite effectively and powerfully summarized by Emmanuel Macron's speech, where he said that there is a wave of Muslim separatism in France, which they would fight at all costs. Muslim separatism in France is very vague. It does not make any sense. But being a president of one of the greatest economies and important countries in the world, he should have been more careful in choosing his words, because Muslim separatism means that the Muslims of France actually want to start a civil war against the French people in France and create their own country. I don't believe that's what the Muslims of France think, but perhaps that's what they will think now. Because you might have heard of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Perhaps the French president's words might just become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But let's hope that does not happen. Moreover, parochial right-wing populist politicians in France have further fueled the fire of Islamophobia to use it as fuel to increase their electoral bases and improve their chances of winning elections. Particularly, Marine Le Penn was one of the populist right-wing politicians who contested against Emmanuel Macron in the 2017 French elections, and she lost to Macron by a very thin majority, which shows how xenophobic and Islamophobic the electorate of France really is, because she was openly opposed to any Muslim migrants in the country, and she had very radical ideas about the presence of Muslims, about immigration, and all of those ideas. So let's talk about Charlie Hebdo now. So the Charlie Hebdo is basically a media outlet in France with a bi-weekly magazine that they publish, which contains cartoons. It's a satirical publication, and by satire it means that they try to joke around with things and mock things in unconventional ways which are not clear, using subtleties and sarcasm. And Charlie Hebdo has a history of attacks on Muslim values and Islam and the Muslim population of France, and they have made Prophet Muhammad's caricatures before as well, which drew international condemnation, and attacks on Charlie Hebdo offices have happened in the past as well. Particularly in 2015, two Muslim brothers entered the offices of Charlie Hebdo and murdered 12 employees because they had published the caricatures of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But despite all of this international reaction, despite all of this carnage that their activities have generated, they have refused to let go or change their anti-Muslim and Islamophobic stance, and they have pledged to continue doing what they are doing and exercising their much valued freedom of expression. Now, why is that? Why would Charlie Hebdo, in the face of annihilation and a very big threat to their lives, continue to do this? Well, simply because Charlie Hebdo was an unknown magazine with no popularity, with little resources, and with really nothing to go about, and everybody wants to be great and known in the world, and this is the path that they chose. So if they abandon their Islamophobic and Muslim hatred narrative, then they would once again become irrelevant in the world. So this brings them a lot of international popularity and coverage, which is something that every media house craves for. So that's the primary reason why they don't let go of their hate-filled narrative. And interestingly, I did not think that the French state was involved, the state of France, the government was involved in supporting Charlie Hebdo in any way previously. But ever since Emmanuel Macron's speech and his comments that the French state is not involved has actually produced a lot of confusions, and I believe that the French state might be involved in promoting Charlie Hebdo, protecting Charlie Hebdo from exercising its right to freedom of expression according to them. So now let's turn to Emmanuel Macron's speech, which generated the most reaction in the world. So it was a really unprecedented Islamophobic speech. Something like that has not come from France in a long time. And he called Islam a religion in crisis all over the world and sought to quash the Muslim separatism in France. Now these are very bold and stark words against a huge population within France and the world in general, knowing at the same time that France has a lot of important economic relationships with various Muslim countries. He took that risk. I'm not sure why he did that, because until now Emmanuel Macron is a very prudent and a very man and a very successful politician, and has been generally good at handling a lot of crises in France, especially if you remember the Yellow Vest movement and protests that were burning Paris and France up. He was able to contain them and he was able to appease to them. So in a way, I think Macron seemed to propagate the clash of civilization hypothesis in his speech largely, and actually he voiced the uneasiness of many Western white leaders on the question of Islamism, Islamophobia, and Muslims' mobilization within France. And he said that he will defend the French freedom of expression to the ultimate extent. Now, if you remember, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave a slap to the face of French President Emmanuel Macron, and he said that freedom of expression and speech must have limits, and it should not hurt the sentiments of any group. And he was right in doing so, because Canada also has a large population of Muslims, and the Canadian government simply cannot afford to alienate them. But apparently Macron was willing to alienate them. Perhaps his electoral base does not lie with the Muslims and it lies with the French people. Perhaps that is why. Because a politician can never be as stupid as to alienate his own electorate. That would mean political suicide. So let's look at the international reaction that we have seen so far. So the Muslim world reacted very strongly to the comments by the French president. They started, various Muslim countries and big businesses and retail outlets all over the Muslim world completely boycotted French products, and that was a big blow to the French multinational corporations. And naturally, a lot of pressure came on the French president to do something about it. And he apologized later on and requested the Muslim world not to boycott their product, but that did not change much. We have seen the Erdogan, the Turkish President Erdogan's speech as well. That was also a clear warning to France and the French presidency that do not desecrate our Muslim values, because if you do, there will be a strong reaction and you will not like it. That was a clear, warning from a powerful country, from a powerful president. And then we also had a very interesting tweet by the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad. He basically said that for all the great crimes that the French colonial empire committed in the past, Muslims have a right to shame and kill millions of French people. Now that is a very dangerous tweet indeed, but he did that anyway. And the Gulf world, on the other hand, the Gulf Muslim world, largely remained silent, which really shows where their loyalties lie. And increasingly, and this points to a very important dichotomy that is being created in the Muslim world. You might have heard of M5, a new Muslim bloc coming into existence with Malaysia, Iran, Turkey, perhaps even China, and now maybe Bosnia, and maybe sometime in the future Pakistan as well. And it is emerging as an important power bloc against the Saudi hegemony of OIC and the Muslim world. And clearly the Saudi camp has decided to side with the Western world in their struggle against Iran, Turkey, and the rising powers of the Middle East. So this is a very clear divergence within the Muslim world, which was largely represented in the Kuala Lumpur summit and then in the OIC, and a couple of other recent developments that we have seen. I highly recommend that you attempt at least 2 or 3 questions on Islamophobia for Pakistan Affairs, and 1 or 2 essays, because the chances of those coming in the exam are very high. Thank you very much for your patience. Take care. Allah Hafiz.